As we've been reporting, President Trump is wasting no time on finding a replacement for retiring Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. He says that he will announce his choice on July 9th. But as the Russia cloud looms over the White House, could making a pick before the special counsel's investigation is finished lead to a constitutional crisis? David Litt, former speechwriter for President Barack Obama, is in Washington. He's currently the head writer for Funny or Die. Joins us now. Hey, David, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So give us a sense here and break down your argument. How could making a Supreme Court pick actually end up turning into a constitutional crisis?
Well, of course, we don't know how the Mueller investigation is going to turn out. We don't know what it will find. But if it finds that there was collusion or outright conspiracy or anything worse than that, the Constitution gives us some remedies for what you do about politicians. You can vote out a president. You can vote out legislators. It does not give us remedies for what to do with justices who were appointed under circumstances that we now know, which in this case we would, were totally illegitimate. And we're going to have to, as a country, figure that out. And it's going to be very, very difficult. And it's going to threaten the integrity of the judiciary itself.
But the Republicans at this point, David, as you know, have really the voting power, and they want to push this forward. So do you see anything changing if they want to sort of get someone in there before midterms?
I suspect that Mitch McConnell is not watching this interview waiting to hear what I think he should do. I think he's going to go as fast as he possibly can. He's going to ram this through. Don't forget, Neil Gorsuch was also rammed through, right? They invoked the nuclear option to get that done in under 60 votes. That's the first time they did that. However, I think that we could be setting ourselves up for a serious crisis down the road where, let's say 20 years from now, we are seeing 5-4 extremely unprecedented decisions that we all know would never have taken place if it weren't for Vladimir Putin's meddling in our election. I don't know how we, the people, are going to be able to handle that kind of repeated reshaping of our Constitution, not just for a few years, but for decades, knowing that it took place because of the intervention of a hostile foreign power, if that's what we find out.
You know, the Supreme Court has historically been viewed as really above partisan politics. Do you get the sense the Trump administration has turned this into more of a political process? And how do you change the tide if that is the case?
The Supreme Court has never been totally immune from politics, but both President Trump and his allies in Congress seem to feel that they're kind of picking a new team member. Justice Roberts famously talked about his role as an umpire calling balls and strikes. Mitch McConnell seems to think he just got a draft pick. And Trump, for the first time, I believe, for a presidential candidate, didn't just talk about the kind of justice he would like to appoint. He put out a list of justices that he might appoint. That's a new encroachment of the political process on what's supposed to be an independent judiciary. So all of these things are challenging the integrity of the court little by little. And the Russia probe, obviously, if it finds evidence of something more severe than, what we've seen so far, if there's fire to go with all the smoke, then it's going to make things a lot worse.
David, we're seeing, you mentioned we the people earlier in this interview, we're seeing folks taking to the streets in cities across this country over immigration. How does we the people, the folks out there in America, counter a Supreme Court nominee when these aren't folks who are nominated for 4 years, they're nominated for life? How does anyone counter that on the streets?
Well, I think that we have seen for generations Supreme Courts that have been out of step with what the people, the majority of the American people, want. I believe the last time we had a majority of the court appointed by Democrats, it was 1969. So most Americans have never been alive during a time when the court hasn't been conservative. This is going to accelerate that trend. It's going to make it worse. I do think that if it turns out that the new 5-4 majority on the court came to being because of Vladimir Putin, the next Democratic administration will probably be thinking about ways to reform the court and make sure that Putin's influence isn't felt for decades. It's one thing for we, the people in the streets, to be working within the system that we all grew up in. But that system, I don't think, needs to include foreign powers getting to pick justices for life.
David Litt, thank you so much for joining us, David, with your perspective on the Supreme Court.
Thank you so much.
And Michael Graham joins us now. He's a CBSN political contributor, Boston Herald columnist, and politics editor for NHJournal.com. Michael, you heard it there. A lot of ifs to David's column. What do you make of his argument?
Well, you often hear the phrase, we have one president at a time, and usually they're referring to maybe at the transition point where one's coming in, one's going out. But my counter argument to David is we are entitled to at least one president at a time. And if you have a president who can't do basic things like nominate somebody for a Supreme Court vacancy, you don't really have a president. And the idea that you would say, well, one day this president might be impeached, and one day we might discover that he did something bad. And so, he can't do anything until then. I don't know how the system would work. And the glaring obvious example is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was forced out of office. He appointed 2 Supreme Court nominees. Nobody said, oh, we can't have Justice Rehnquist anymore. Nixon appointed him. No, the system works, and the system isn't predicated on every individual being perfect. The president gets to nominate somebody, but there's a reason why the Senate reviews them. The Senate does not review Judge Gorsuch or whoever it is based on what do you think of Donald Trump? Did he pass the test? No, it's is this jurist qualified? Do they have the right temperament? Do they have the skills? If they do, it doesn't matter if it was nominated by Trump or Obama or Satan. You end up with a Supreme Court justice. That's the system. The system works pretty good, and I think that may be what David is overlooking.
So you have faith in the system. A lot of folks completely look at the Supreme Court as an institution that should never be political. But if folks are starting to feel that it is political and it leans too far to the right or one direction, how do folks at home counter that, Michael?
Well, a couple of things. I think it's naive to think that the court is suddenly becoming political. Back in FDR's day, they had a major crisis over the court. When the court ruled on Roe versus Wade, the American people were bitterly divided. 45 years later, people are still bitterly divided, and yet the court is still the court. This notion that the court is somehow in a danger, and I think there's an interesting point in David's piece, that we're in danger of losing credibility. I checked Gallup's numbers. They ask, do you feel confident in the institution? Today, about 40% of Americans say they feel pretty confident about the Supreme Court. 10 years ago, that was down to 32%. It's actually gone up. The same with the presidency. Today, about 32% of Americans say they feel confident in it. 10 years ago, it was down to 25%. My point is that the confidence in these institutions ebb and flow, often due to partisanship. Do I like the people who are there? But we are not in a credibility crisis for the court. And there is certainly no reason to vacate a president's constitutional power because you think that one day someone might find out that he did something icky.
So ultimately, Michael, you see whoever the president nominates as being able to go through before, as the president wants, before midterms.
Look, if the president nominates someone who's lousy, the Senate should reject them. It doesn't matter how the investigation comes out. Remember, George W. Bush nominated Harriet Miers. She was a terrible pick, and many of us in conservative media started complaining immediately. He was forced to withdraw her. It wasn't a judgment on W's character or on Harriet Miers. She just wasn't a good pick. But if this system, and I really don't understand how releasing a list in advance undermines the system. I think it's amazingly transparent. You're not likely to get any surprises. You may not like President Trump's choice, but it's going to be someone who's thoroughly vetted by the Senate, by the public, by the media. And if that person's qualified, no matter what happens in the future, what difference will it make? One more thing to add. If you buy the notion that President Trump's Supreme Court choices should be vacated if he's later convicted of collusion, what about the executive orders that he signed? What about the bills that he signed? I mean, we just can't do a presidency this way where if it's retroactive, sorry, we decided we don't like you anymore, so we're going to get rid of your stuff. It's just our system is specifically designed to be bigger than any one president, no matter how he or she turns out to behave.
Michael, I also want to highlight, you've got a new column coming out on Monday, and in it you suggest that the open seat may actually be a boon to Democrats in midterms. What? Can you explain this one?
So it depends on how they approach it. The challenge they have is keeping their team energized about doing something about the court. And let's face it, as you've pointed out many times today here in CBSN, they don't really have the votes. The Republicans can do what they want. But you want to keep them energized, but without drifting over into crazy. I don't think that giving Republicans a conservative on the court is going to inspire voters in November. You're making them happy. What motivates voters tends to be fear or concern. And so if Republicans are getting what they want and Democrats are making their case, then I think you kind of end up with an even split. But if Democrats drift over into kind of overly zealous, if we have more incidents of people being thrown out of restaurants, if the marching in the street turns from animated to ugly, I think you could make a lot of swing right-leaning voters nervous about, oh my gosh, I got to turn out because if these crazies get in power, we're going to spend the next 2 years fighting off craziness. And that is the sweet spot Democrats are looking for. Energized, but not over the top when it comes to fighting over the Supreme Court.
And we know midterms hard to get turnout, so interesting to hear your argument that this could certainly make a difference for the Democratic Party. Michael Graham, always grateful to have you on, Michael. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.